The most powerful weapons aren't always the loudest. Sometimes, they're just words, delivered at precisely the right moment. When billionaire tech mogul Thomas Blackwood discovered his 14-year-old son Noah was being tormented by his physics teacher for using a wheelchair, he could have unleashed lawyers, made threats, or demanded firings. He had the money and influence to destroy careers with a single phone call. But Thomas understood something more fundamental about power. True strength isn't measured by how hard you can strike, but by how precisely you can deliver justice. Walking into that classroom, seeing his brilliant son shrinking under the cruel mockery of an educator who had sworn to nurture young minds, Thomas spoke just one sentence. 8 words that changed everything, not just for his son, but for an entire school system. What happens when a father's love collides with discrimination? When a teacher who belittles the disabled suddenly finds the tables catastrophically turned? And how can a single moment of accountability ripple outward to transform lives in ways no one could have predicted? This is a story about karma's perfect symmetry and how sometimes the universe delivers justice in the most unexpected packages. The sprawling estate of Thomas Blackwood stood as a monument to success, but inside its walls, the 48-year-old tech mogul found himself facing a challenge his billions couldn't solve. Thomas gazed at the framed photo on his mahogany desk, his son Noah, 14, with a bright smile that belied the daily struggles he faced with cerebral palsy. "Dad, I'm ready," Noah called from the hallway, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that broke Thomas's heart. Thomas stepped out to find Noah expertly maneuvering his wheelchair toward the front door, his backpack balanced carefully on his lap. Despite the custom-fitted, top-of-the-line wheelchair Thomas had specially designed for him, Noah still faced a world that wasn't built with him in mind. "Big test today?" Thomas asked, grabbing his keys. Noah's expression darkened momentarily before the practiced smile returned. "Physics with Ms. Powell." Thomas noticed the subtle change, but said nothing as they headed toward the car. The specially modified Bentley had cost a small fortune to adapt for Noah's needs, but Thomas would have spent 10 times that amount without hesitation. As they drove through the ornate gates of Westlake Academy, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on the irony. The prestigious school had practically begged for his endowment 3 years ago. The new science wing bore the Blackwood name, yet his son still came home with tear-stained cheeks more often than not. "I can go in alone," Noah insisted as Thomas pulled into the drop-off area. "I know you can." Thomas smiled, masking his concern. "But humor your old man today. I'd like to speak with Principal Donovan about that accessibility ramp they promised for the auditorium." Noah seemed relieved, though he tried not to show it. Thomas had long suspected something more than typical teenage angst was troubling his brilliant son. Noah's IQ tested well above genius level, yet his grades had been slipping in recent months. The marble hallways of Westlake Academy echoed with privilege. Students in crisp uniforms parted like the Red Sea as Thomas wheeled Noah through the corridors. Some nodded respectfully. Thomas Blackwood's reputation preceded him, while others averted their eyes from Noah, a reaction Thomas had grown to detest. "Mr. Blackwood, what a pleasant surprise," Principal Donovan effused, emerging from his office with an outstretched hand. "We weren't expecting you today. The best inspections are unannounced, wouldn't you agree?" Thomas replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. After seeing Noah off to his first class, history with Mr. Bellamy, one of the few teachers Noah spoke positively about, Thomas and Principal Donovan discussed the accessibility improvements Thomas had been pushing for. "These changes take time, Mr. Blackwood," Donovan explained with practiced patience. "The board has approved the funding, but the architectural plans were submitted 3 months ago," Thomas finished, "and approved 2 weeks later. I know because my company handled the paperwork personally." Donovan's smile faltered. "Yes, well, there are other considerations." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Such as, perhaps we could discuss this in my office?" Donovan suggested, glancing nervously at a group of passing students. As they walked, Thomas subtly checked his watch, a state-of-the-art piece of technology that looked ordinary but contained features the public wouldn't see for years. Last week, concerned about Noah's increasing withdrawal, Thomas had given his son a matching watch. What Noah didn't know was that Thomas could activate a live audio feed from it remotely. It had been a last resort, an invasion of privacy Thomas had wrestled with ethically. But after finding Noah sobbing in his room the previous night, refusing to explain what had happened at school, Thomas's paternal instincts had overruled his principles. In Donovan's office, as the principal droned on about budgetary constraints, Thomas discreetly activated the connection. Noah was now in his physics class with Ms. Helen Powell, a teacher with impressive credentials who had joined Westlake 2 years ago. At first, Thomas heard only the expected sounds of a classroom: papers shuffling, the squeak of markers on a whiteboard, Ms. Powell's voice explaining kinetic energy. Then came a question directed at the class, followed by silence. Thomas's attention sharpened when he heard his son's name. "Noah," Ms. Powell said, her tone changing subtly. "Since you seem to be daydreaming again, perhaps you'd like to explain to the class how force applies to acceleration?" Thomas heard Noah's voice, softer but steady. "Force equals mass times acceleration, according to Newton's second law. The rate of change of momentum is directly proportional to the applied force and occurs in the same direction." A pause followed, and Thomas expected approval for the textbook perfect answer. Instead, he heard a cutting laugh. Well, someone's been reading ahead again," Ms. Powell said with unmistakable mockery. "Tell me, Noah, do you think memorizing definitions makes up for your other deficiencies?" Shocked, Thomas nearly dropped his coffee. Donovan was still talking, unaware of what Thomas was hearing. I don't understand the question," Noah replied, his voice smaller now. "Clearly," Ms. Powell responded. "Perhaps if you spent less time being the class show-off and more time on practical applications, you might actually earn your place here rather than rolling in on your father's checkbook." Murmurs and a few nervous laughs rippled through the classroom. Thomas felt his blood pressure soaring, his knuckles white around his coffee cup. "Ms. Powell, I know the answer," another student voice chimed in. "Of course you do, Jasmine," Ms. Powell replied warmly. "Someone with your coordination would naturally understand the relationship between force and motion better than others." The implication hung in the air like poison. Thomas had heard enough. Abruptly standing, he cut Principal Donovan off mid-sentence. "Excuse me, I need to check on my son," Thomas said, his voice dangerously controlled. "But we haven't finished discussing the—" "We're done," Thomas replied, already striding toward the door. As he navigated the hallways toward the physics lab, Thomas reviewed what he'd just heard with growing fury. This wasn't the first instance. It couldn't be. Noah's declining enthusiasm, his reluctance to discuss certain classes, his insistence that he could handle things alone. It all made terrible sense now. Thomas paused outside the physics lab, collecting himself. Through the small window in the door, he could see Ms. Powell, a slim woman with sharp features and sharper glasses, gesturing animatedly at the whiteboard. His eyes found Noah in the front row, shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller, his wheelchair positioned slightly apart from the other desks. What Thomas witnessed next would forever be seared into his memory. Ms. Powell was demonstrating velocity, rolling a ball across her desk. "Now, can anyone tell me why the ball slows down?" she asked. Noah raised his hand, but Ms. Powell pointedly ignored him, calling on others. When no one provided the correct answer, Noah kept his hand raised persistently. With an exaggerated sigh, Ms. Powell finally acknowledged him. "Yes, Noah, enlighten us with wisdom from your throne of wheels." Several students gasped. Others laughed nervously. Noah's face flushed deep red, but he answered with dignity. "Friction and air resistance act as opposing forces that reduce the ball's kinetic energy over time." Ms. Powell's lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "Correct. I suppose being constantly aware of friction is one advantage to your situation." Thomas had seen and heard enough. His hand closed around the door handle just as Ms. Powell continued her lesson, moving toward Noah's desk. "Let's use Noah as an example," she said, her voice falsely sweet. "If Noah's wheelchair were to roll down a hill, what factors would affect his acceleration, besides the obvious advantage of already having wheels?" The laughter was louder this time, less restrained. Thomas saw his son's eyes glistening with unshed tears, his knuckles white as he gripped his armrests. In that moment, Thomas Blackwood, the man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of several small nations, whose name adorned buildings across 3 continents, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, felt something he hadn't experienced since his own childhood, utter helplessness. But it lasted only a second. Thomas Blackwood pushed open the door to Ms. Helen Powell's physics classroom, his expression carved from stone and his eyes blazing with the cold fire that had intimidated corporate rivals and world leaders alike. The laughter died instantly. Ms. Powell turned, annoyed at the interruption, then froze as she recognized the figure standing in her doorway. Thomas's eyes locked with Noah's, seeing the mixture of shame, relief, and fear in his son's face. In that silent exchange, a promise passed between them, one that Thomas intended to keep, starting now. He stepped fully into the classroom, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded like thunder in the sudden silence. The classroom fell into a silence so complete that the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Miss Helen Powell stood frozen, her hand still hovering over Noah's desk, the mocking smile not yet fully faded from her lips. Thomas Blackwood's presence filled the room like a gathering storm. At 48, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from building an empire from nothing. His tailored suit, understated yet unmistakably expensive, contrasted sharply with the casual contempt he'd just witnessed. "Please," Thomas said with deadly calm, "don't let me interrupt your physics lesson." Miss Powell straightened, smoothing her blouse nervously. "Mr. Blackwood, what a surprise. We weren't expecting visitors today." Her voice carried a forced cheerfulness that rang hollow in the tension-filled room. Thomas's gaze swept across the classroom, noting the uncomfortable shifts of the students, the downcast eyes, the few phones discreetly pointed in his direction. His focus returned to Ms. Powell. "I particularly enjoyed your creative example about acceleration and wheelchairs," Thomas continued, his voice measured but edged with steel. "Perhaps you could explain the educational value of singling out my son's disability for classroom ridicule?" Ms. Powell paled. "I think you misunderstood the context." "Did I?" Thomas took 3 deliberate steps forward. "Because from where I stood, it sounded remarkably like an educated professional mocking a 14-year-old boy for circumstances beyond his control." Several students exchanged glances. A girl in the back row, Jasmine, Thomas presumed from the earlier exchange, was openly recording now, her phone no longer hidden. "Mr. Blackwood," Ms. Powell attempted again, regaining some composure, "I use examples that students can relate to. Sometimes humor helps complex concepts stick." "Humor," Thomas repeated, the word hanging in the air like an indictment. Noah looked up at his father, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face: embarrassment, relief, and something else, pride. Thomas moved to stand beside Noah's wheelchair, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Miss Powell, let me be absolutely clear." His voice dropped to a near whisper that somehow reached every corner of the silent room. "The only person in this classroom who needs to worry about acceleration is you, because your career is about to experience a dramatic downward trajectory." Someone in the back of the classroom whispered, "Oh snap," followed by a nervous titter quickly silenced by Thomas's unwavering stare. Miss Powell's face flushed with anger, her momentary fear giving way to indignation. "You can't just walk in here and threaten me. I've been teaching for 15 years. My methods get results." "Results?" Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Let's discuss results. Noah, what was your grade on the last physics test?" Noah hesitated, then answered quietly, D-. Thomas raised an eyebrow at Miss Powell. A D- for a child who built a working Tesla coil at age 9 and corrected errors in a published paper on quantum mechanics last summer. "Test scores don't lie," Miss Powell insisted, crossing her arms defensively. "No," Thomas agreed, "they don't. Which is why I took the liberty of reviewing Noah's test before coming here today." Miss Powell's confidence faltered visibly. "You had no right." "As his father, I have every right," Thomas countered. "Especially when I notice my brilliant son suddenly failing a subject he's passionate about." Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew several folded sheets of paper. "Noah's answers were correct, Miss Powell. All of them. Yet you marked them wrong." Particularly interesting was question 17, where Noah provided a more advanced solution than your answer key anticipated. Miss Powell's lips parted, but no words came out. The class stirred, whispers growing louder. "Dad?" Noah tugged at his father's sleeve, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. Thomas squeezed Noah's shoulder reassuringly before continuing. This leads me to a rather disturbing conclusion, Miss Powell. You've been deliberately failing my son. That's absurd. Ms. Powell protested, but her voice cracked. Is it? Because I've spoken with other parents whose children use mobility aids or have visible disabilities. They report similar experiences with you. Curious pattern, wouldn't you say? The classroom door opened, and Principal Donovan appeared, slightly out of breath. Mr. Blackwood, Ms. Powell, what's happening here? Thomas turned calmly. Perfect timing, Principal Donovan. I was just about to explain to Ms. Powell who actually funded the Westlake Academy's new science wing. Ms. Powell's eyes widened in growing horror. You see, Thomas continued, addressing the entire classroom now, when I donated the money for this building, I had one condition that wasn't publicized. Can you guess what it was, Ms. Powell? She shook her head mutely. That every classroom, laboratory, and facility be fully accessible. Not just compliant with legal minimums, but genuinely, thoughtfully accessible. Thomas's voice grew passionate. I insisted on adjustable lab tables, specialized equipment, modified computers, resources that would ensure every student could participate fully regardless of physical ability. Thomas's gaze hardened as he focused again on Ms. Powell. Resources you've consistently denied my son access to, despite them being available in your storage closet. Resources that might have helped other students like him excel in your class. Principal Donovan looked stunned. Ms. Powell, is this true? Before she could answer, a student near the front raised her hand tentatively. She told Zach he couldn't use the adaptive calculator last month. Said he needed to learn to do things the normal way. Another student chimed in, and she moved the adjustable desk to the back to use as a demonstration table. Ms. Powell's face contorted with anger. These accommodations give unfair advantages. These students need to learn how the real world works. The real world, Thomas interrupted softly, is what you make it, Ms. Powell. Some build barriers. Others remove them. He turned to his son. Noah, would you like to stay for the remainder of this class, or shall we go? Noah looked around at his classmates, many of whom were watching him with new eyes, not pity, but something closer to admiration. His gaze lingered on Ms. Powell, who now looked smaller somehow, diminished. I'd like to stay, Noah said firmly. We were discussing Newton's laws. I find them fascinating. Thomas nodded, pride evident in his eyes. Very well. He turned back to Ms. Powell, who stood rigid with tension. I believe this is where I say just one sentence that should clarify everything for you, Ms. Powell. The room held its collective breath. Thomas leaned slightly forward and spoke with quiet certainty. You will never teach my son, or anyone's child, in this school again. The words hung in the air, not shouted but delivered with such conviction that they seemed to physically impact Ms. Powell, who took a small step backward. Principal Donovan cleared his throat. Ms. Powell, please gather your things and come to my office immediately. His tone left no room for argument. Mr. Reynolds, he addressed an older student in the back row, please go to the faculty lounge and ask Mr. Davidson to cover this class for the remainder of the period. Ms. Powell stood frozen for a moment, the full implications of what had just transpired washing over her. Her carefully constructed world, her authority, her position, her reputation, was crumbling before her eyes. This isn't fair, she finally managed, her voice barely audible. One parent shouldn't have this much power. Thomas regarded her with something almost like pity. This isn't about power, Ms. Powell. It's about accountability. As Principal Donovan escorted Ms. Powell from the classroom, the students erupted into whispers and exclamations. Several immediately surrounded Noah, their attitudes noticeably changed. Thomas watched as his son straightened in his wheelchair, answering questions from classmates who perhaps were truly seeing him for the first time. The weight that had seemed to press Noah down these past months visibly lifted. Before leaving, Thomas caught his son's eye and gave him a subtle nod. Between them passed an understanding. This moment had changed something fundamental. Not because Thomas was a billionaire who could make things happen with a word, but because he was a father who refused to let his son believe that cruelty was something to be endured. In the hallway, Thomas found Principal Donovan waiting for him. Ms. Powell had already been directed to the administrative offices. I had no idea, Donovan began, his face ashen. The reports from other teachers, her credentials. Sometimes the most dangerous prejudices hide behind impressive qualifications. Thomas replied. I want a complete review of every grade she's given to students with disabilities. And I want that accessibility ramp installed by the end of the month. Principal Donovan nodded quickly. Of course, Mr. Blackwood. I'll personally oversee both matters. As Thomas turned to leave, Donovan called after him. What you did in there? Standing up for your son like that. Thomas paused. Should be unremarkable. Every child deserves that, whether their parent is a billionaire or not. Back in his car, Thomas allowed himself a moment to process what had happened. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of confrontation. He was accustomed to high-stakes business negotiations, not defending his son from cruelty. His phone buzzed with a notification. The video from the classroom had already been uploaded to social media. Thomas considered having his PR team contain it, but decided against it. Let people see what had happened. Let them understand that even billionaires' children face discrimination. And perhaps more importantly, let them see discrimination being challenged. By the time school ended, the video had gone viral. Noah emerged from the building walking taller in his wheelchair than Thomas had seen in months. Several classmates accompanied him, including Jasmine, whose recording had sparked the online firestorm. Dad? Noah said as Thomas helped him into the car. You didn't have to do that. Thomas looked at his son seriously. Yes, Noah, I did. She'll never get another teaching job after this, Noah pointed out, a trace of concern in his voice. Actions have consequences, Thomas replied. But her future is in her hands now, not mine. As they drove away from Westlake Academy, neither could have predicted just how prophetic those words would prove to be, nor how intricately their lives would remain connected to Helen Powell's in the years to come. The confrontation that had begun with a single sentence was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The video of Thomas Blackwood confronting Helen Powell spread across the internet with stunning velocity. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed 17 million times. News outlets picked up the story, running headlines like, Billionaire father stands up to teacher bullying disabled son, and classroom confrontation exposes discrimination at elite school. For Noah, returning to school the following week was a dramatically different experience. Students who had previously avoided eye contact now greeted him warmly. Teachers who had been passively supportive became actively accommodating. The whispers behind his back transformed into open invitations to study groups and lunch tables. It's weird, Noah told his father over dinner one evening, 3 weeks after the incident. I'm still the same person I was before. Nothing about me has changed. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. People often need permission to see past their assumptions. Sometimes that permission comes in unexpected forms. What Thomas didn't share with Noah was the aftermath that was unfolding for Helen Powell. True to his prediction, her career had experienced a dramatic downward trajectory. After her dismissal from Westlake Academy, Helen had found herself radioactive in educational circles. No school would touch her, not with the video serving as an eternal digital record of her behavior. Her teaching license was under review by the state board. Former students had come forward with similar stories of subtle discrimination and targeted humiliation. Thomas had not pursued any further action against her personally. He didn't need to. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict swiftly and mercilessly. 6 months passed. Winter turned to spring. Noah flourished at Westlake under new teachers who recognized his brilliance without fixating on his wheelchair. Thomas had all but forgotten Helen Powell when fate orchestrated its most unexpected turn. It happened on a rainy Tuesday in April. Thomas was working late at his office when his assistant knocked on the door. Sir, there's a Dr. Lena Winters on line 3. She says it's regarding Helen Powell. Thomas frowned. The name meant nothing to him, but Powell's did. Curiosity piqued. He took the call. Mr. Blackwood, a measured female voice began. I'm a neurologist at Mercy Memorial Hospital. I have a patient who's asked me to contact you. Helen Powell. Thomas's grip tightened on the receiver. What could she possibly want from me? Nothing, Dr. Winters replied simply. She asked me to inform you of her condition. She specifically said you'd understand why. Thomas listened in stunned silence as Dr. Winters explained that Helen Powell had been diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder that causes the immune system to attack the nerves. In severe cases, like Helen's, it could lead to temporary paralysis. She's currently unable to walk, Dr. Winters concluded. We're hopeful for a full recovery, but it will take months of rehabilitation. She'll be using a wheelchair for the foreseeable future. The irony was not lost on Thomas. Why would she want me to know this? She said something about karma, Dr. Winters replied. And learning. That's all she would tell me. After hanging up, Thomas sat motionless at his desk for a long time. He had wished many things upon Helen Powell: accountability, understanding, remorse, but never this. Never physical suffering that mirrored his son's daily reality. He shared the news with Noah that evening, unsure how his son would react. Noah was quiet for several minutes before speaking. Is it wrong that part of me thinks she deserves it? No, Thomas answered honestly. It's human to want people who hurt us to understand our pain. But another part of me feels terrible for her. Noah continued, conflict evident in his eyes. Thomas nodded. That's human too. And perhaps the better part of being human. The following day, Noah approached his father with a surprising request. He wanted to start an anonymous online support group for people newly adjusting to life with mobility impairments. I know what helped me, Noah explained. Maybe I can help others. Thomas helped Noah set up the website, impressed by his son's empathy. The group grew quickly, attracting members from across the country. Noah spent hours each week sharing advice on everything from navigating public spaces to dealing with stares and awkward questions. 3 months later, a new member joined the group using the username NewToWheels42. Her posts revealed a profound struggle not just with physical limitations, but with a deep sense of shame and cosmic justice. I deserve this, one post read. Every stare, every inaccessible building, every moment of frustration. I earned them all through my own cruelty. Noah, moderating under his own pseudonym, responded with characteristic wisdom. No one deserves disability. And no one deserves discrimination. Both simply exist, and we learn to live with them. Thomas suspected the truth before Noah did. The writing style, the specific references to teaching, the overwhelming guilt. NewToWheels42 was almost certainly Helen Powell. Noah continued to counsel her, unaware of her identity. He suggested adaptive techniques, recommended supportive cushions for her wheelchair, and most importantly, encouraged her to forgive herself. Wheelchairs don't define us, he wrote in one powerful exchange. They're just tools that help us move through the world. The real journey happens inside us. A year after the confrontation at Westlake Academy, Thomas received an invitation to speak at a disability advocacy conference in Chicago. Noah insisted on accompanying him. I want to meet other advocates, he explained. Maybe connect with some members of my support group who might be there. The conference center hummed with energy. Hundreds of people with various disabilities gathered with researchers, policymakers, and allies. Noah navigated the crowds with confidence, his wheelchair no longer a source of shame, but a proud part of his identity. During a break between sessions, Thomas watched from a distance as Noah approached a woman also using a wheelchair. Something in her posture, rigid, uncomfortable, new to this, caught his attention. When she turned slightly, Thomas felt a jolt of recognition. Helen Powell looked dramatically different. The sleek, polished teacher who had tormented Noah was gone, replaced by a woman whose face showed the marks of humility and hard-won wisdom. She hadn't noticed Noah yet, focused on adjusting her chair to reach a water fountain. Thomas held his breath, uncertain whether to intervene. But Noah had already reached her side. Here, Thomas heard his son say, if you angle it like this and approach from the side, it's easier. Helen looked up to thank him, and Thomas saw the exact moment recognition dawned. Her face drained of color. Noah, she whispered, the name barely audible. Noah tilted his head, confusion giving way to understanding. Ms. Powell. Thomas moved closer, ready to protect his son if needed. But what happened next stunned him. I'm sorry, Helen said, tears filling her eyes. I'm so deeply sorry. Noah was silent for a long moment before responding. I know. How could you possibly know? She asked. Noah smiled gently. NewToWheels42. Your posts helped others in the group too, you know. Helen's hand flew to her mouth. That was you. All this time. Thomas reached them just as Noah extended his hand to his former teacher. Sometimes the universe has strange ways of teaching us empathy, Noah said. But what matters is that we learn. Helen looked past Noah to Thomas, bracing herself for his anger. Instead, she found quiet assessment in his gaze. The sentence I said to you that day, Thomas said quietly. About never teaching again? Helen nodded. remembering the words that had ended her career. "I was wrong," Thomas continued. "What you've learned, what Noah helped you learn, that should be taught, just differently than before." As the next session was called to order, the three of them sat together, former adversaries now linked by extraordinary circumstances. Thomas watched his son speaking animatedly with the woman who had once mocked him, explaining the advocacy work he'd been doing. The universe had indeed delivered its own perfect form of justice, not through punishment alone, but through transformation. Helen Powell had lost the use of her legs temporarily, but gained something far more valuable: true understanding. Noah had faced cruelty, but discovered his power to heal. And Thomas, who had delivered that devastating one-sentence verdict in the classroom, now witnessed something more powerful than any judgment he could have pronounced. Sometimes karma worked not just by giving people what they deserved, but by giving them what they needed.